Unconfined is a podcast of the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future in Baltimore, Maryland. The podcast about industrial food animal production and its emerging alternatives. You can find us online at clf.jhsph.edu. Mike Milley is our sound engineer and produced our theme music. Your hosts are me, Tom Philpott, and Christine Grillo. Paulette Wilson is our producer, and Natalie Wood-Wright is the executive producer. The opinions expressed here are not necessarily those of Johns Hopkins University or of the Center for a Livable Future.
This episode of the Unconfined Podcast continues an exploration of aquatic foods. Today we have special guest Philip Loring with us to talk about, among other things, possible solutions to the harms created by industrialized food animal production, especially with regard to aquatic foods, and what it might mean to regenerate fisheries. Philip is an award-winning author, social scientist, former academic with many peer-reviewed research papers to his name, and he's a global director at the Nature Conservancy, where he is helping to staff up the fairly new Human Dimension science team. Welcome, Philip, and thank you for joining us on Unconfined.
Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. Let's first talk about what's wrong with global fisheries. What's going on there? What are the demands and the pressures that they're facing?
Sure. Well, it's a good starting point. Though starting with the bad news, there's bad news and good news, right? We fish more, we take more fish out of the ocean and produce more fish in the ocean now than ever before, and that feeds a lot of people, right? That's good news. And in the last 20 years or so, we have seen improvements in how sustainable many ocean fisheries are, and in the sustainability of how some aquaculture operations are. That being said, we are still taking so much from the oceans. They are very much at or past their limit. And in recent years, demand has grown such that we've actually seen a bit of a backslide in the sustainability of the fisheries that we're fishing, wild caught fisheries, that is. And at the same time, we have this growing, enormous, and highly industrialized aquaculture industry, which again is producing food, but also has some side effects that we should attend to. And it's interesting, in the last couple of years, for the first time ever, aquaculture produced more fish than wild capture fisheries. And so things in the ocean are changing really rapidly, almost so quick that it's hard to keep up.
Right. So the increased demand for aquatic foods, is that just because the population's growing or people's tastes are shifting?
I think it's a little bit of multiple things. For one, this is a new and growing business, right? And there's lots of incentives by food companies, seafood companies, to grow their markets, and that's happening. Surely lots of people eat from the sea. A lot of people in developing and underdeveloped nations fish for themselves and eat from the sea. When it comes to population, we've for decades produced more food globally than we need. And so it's a little bit more about access, and it's a little bit more about what companies are wanting to sell and what they're wanting to develop as products. That being said, there are a lot of narratives that have emerged around why to eat more fish. It's very healthy. Certain fish can be very high in omega-3 fatty acids. It can be very sustainable, especially short-lived small fish. And so there's reasons that I think more people are turning to that. Also, climate change. Fish are touted as a sort of lower carbon alternative to other sources of animal protein.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So considering what some of these challenges are, what are the bigger corporations around aquatic foods saying that they're doing? Is there a narrative that they have about how they're helping?
Well, in the last few decades, the narrative of sustainable fisheries has emerged that's sort of very technical in nature and very much oriented around the ecological and biological issues facing single species that we fish. And when framed that way, it's been easy to tell positive, good news sustainability stories about lots of different fisheries, from large fish like tuna to small fish like anchovies. And that's been a boon, especially for large-scale at-sea commercial fishing operations. It hasn't been as great for small-scale community fisheries, that have seen a lot of market competition from the industrial fleets, and have seen a lot of communities have lost, and especially indigenous communities have lost rights to fish as fisheries have become pressured and then managed in new ways where their quotas are introduced and so forth. So there are a few tales sort of out there about fisheries and their sustainability, and some of them usually favoring the larger scale operations are more positive than maybe they ought be.
Okay, so you're saying that some of these narratives focus on the specific species as opposed to looking at the whole picture of the ocean.
That's right, and it gets into this sort of fixation we have or we have had in our food systems of wanting to get specific things all the time and focusing on developing the single resource. And we can do a lot with fisheries and the way we fish to really build up the populations of a specific species as we fish them. Maine lobster is a great example. We've done tremendous things with traditional practices that lobster fishermen in down East Maine and the North Atlantic have been practicing for a long time that have really favored lobsters. Unfortunately, that's really hollowed out the rest of the ecosystem, right? Whenever you put some energy into one species at the expense of others, you start to see declines in the others. And so that's made for a real boon. A lot of lobster are available, but it's also a very vulnerable system because the diversity has gone way down.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's a really interesting way to look at it. And you're from Maine, is that right? Did I read
That's
that
right.
in your book? Okay.
Yeah.
So so when we start talking about how we could do positive things for fisheries and how we can do positive things for the oceans, what is the blue economy that people talk about? And
Sure. Yeah. Well, blue foods, the blue economy. I mean, blue means water in this case, and it's a bit of a riff on the green economy, green jobs, green products, green businesses. But the focus, the specifics here are towards aquatic environments, marine, and sometimes lake and river systems, but usually the oceans. And there's a lot of hubbub around blue jobs, the blue economy, and I think again, with any of these things, there's some good and some challenges to it. I think there's a great recognition and discussion about blue economies that so many people currently rely on the oceans and fisheries for their livelihoods. And that being said, the interest in developing the blue economy does skew again in the direction of the larger scale corporations and transnational agribusinesses, where they're seeing the oceans as a place to move to find new opportunities for business growth now that terrestrial systems are kind of at their limits, right? We've already pushed them at or arguably way past what they're capable of providing. And so now here's the ocean and lots of ways that people see to move food production and expand business opportunities there.
okay, so it's like the new frontier for expanding.
It is, with all of the baggage that comes with that word intact, I think, in the way that a lot of people are approaching it.
Yeah. Okay. And so is there, one thing that I noticed from one of your recent papers was this mention of seaweed farming and how that's touted as a great climate change solution. And the sense I got was that maybe.
That's a great example of it depends. Seafood is healthy, right? Seafood has been used for centuries by indigenous communities in agriculture. It has lots of great uses and applications in agriculture and uses as food. As a fertilizer, as an amendment to animal feed, there's lots of great things for seaweed, like kelp. And um, a lot of seaweed and kelp beds, for example, have also been deforested over the years. And so there's a great opportunity for restoration there. Now, when it comes to climate change, however, there's a bit of a nuance that's really important is that when we think about the carbon that's in the atmosphere that's causing climate change, it's come from two sources. Some of it is biological carbon. It's come from changes in soil. It's come from deforestation. It's come from sort of living material that is now in the atmosphere, right? And then there's geologic carbon, the carbon that's come from under the ground, the fossil fuels. And the climate change issue we're facing right now is really skewed in the direction of the latter. It's far more a geological carbon problem than a biological one. And so the result is that we can't solve a problem on that scale with biological sources or sinks rather. We can solve some of the contributions we've made to climate change that are biological in nature in this way, but we're not going to make gains on the fossil fuel issue in this way. And if I can, there's also one other thing about it as a climate solution. And the idea here isn't just to grow a whole bunch of kelp because it's fast growing. The idea is to grow a bunch and then sink it in the ocean, in the deep ocean. And this is an area we know very little about. And there's something familiar culturally about this idea that a place that we think is empty, a place that we don't know anything about, but that we think it's ours to dump things in or to do with. And I'm also really concerned about sort of that presumption, if that makes sense.
Right. That we can go ahead, the presumption that we can do solutions in a place that we don't know enough about yet is.
Yeah, well, when European settlers came to North America, they saw a world that they believed was unpeopled. They saw a world that they saw as unvalued, undeveloped, unvalued because it was undeveloped, and theirs to do whatever they want with. And the Latin for that is terra nullius, a novel land that's nothing now, but it will be something when we're done with it. And I feel like I see the same presupposition happening with ideas that we can just sink whatever we want to the bottom of the ocean because there's nothing there.
Right. Yeah, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, this idea that, nobody was living here before and nothing was happening, nothing to see.
Right.
But I want to talk a little bit more about some of the ideas about regeneration and solutions for fisheries. And I was just looking at a 2023 paper that you wrote about the differences between terrestrial ecosystem dynamics, like in a farm or a forest, and then the dynamics in an ocean. And I believe what you were saying is that, on land in a terrestrial system, the farmer really has a lot of access to what's going on and maybe some control of what's going on, like the cycling of nutrients and energy. But in fisheries, it's just so vast and time works so differently. And I'm wondering if you can elaborate on that idea for our listeners.
Sure. Yeah, so you're right. On the farm, if we're thinking about something like regeneration, which for the listeners is this idea that we can steward our ecosystems, or in the case of agriculture, our soils, to take what is wasted, to take nutrients from less usable and put them back to more usable forms, that we can work with the natural cycles that happen rather than having to use chemical inputs and amendments. And for a farmer trying to implement regenerative approaches, all of that happens really in their purview, on their field, under the plants they're working with, in the soil. So they have a lot of access to the decisions and can pay attention to with soil tests and make decisions about what to do. Do I cover crop? Do I fallow the land? Right? And make an impact in their particular practice. In the oceans, nutrients cycle very different. It's a vast open system. It's not so bounded to very specific areas. When things die, the nutrients go into the deep ocean again, and they are recycled there, and they're really not even available for the food web unless they get upwelled back to the surface of the water and then end up in the microorganisms and the macroorganisms and fish. And so an individual fisher can't do much to influence that process. They can take fish, maybe they can put the waste overboard, but that's about the end of it. And so to think about how fisheries could support regeneration in marine ecosystems, we have to scale way up to the level of the fishery or multiple fisheries and think, what are we fishing for? And how do we be flexible and maybe switch from one fish to another while one fishery needs to recover? Not expect things out of season, recognize that seasonal cycles matter in fish populations, fish only in certain ways so that we don't get them when they're vulnerable, maybe when they're spawning, right? And so it's that fisheries level flexibility, the willingness to eat diverse things. In a way, we're almost giving our own resilience to the fisheries to recover because we're willing to change when the fisheries need us to.
Right. Okay. So that's a nice lead in to a question about what can we do to make fisheries more regenerative. And one of the things a couple of things I just heard you say is, season specific fishing, I guess, and then cycling through different species. So instead of, wanting tuna all year long, you're going to have to branch out a little bit. And it seems like a diverse diet is a big part of that as well. What can you tell us about regenerating fisheries?
Well, I think to regenerate fisheries, we need to put that in the context of our whole food system, and as consumers, as eaters, um, to eat regeneratively, to think about regenerative cuisine. And it's not just about the seasonality or the availability of the fish, but also about all the other things we're eating that are in that on that plate, that diverse basket of things we're eating from. To not expect things when they're out of season, to lean in with our purchases and our relationships in our community to the things that are being produced within our food shed, so to speak. Because it's that, again, it's that organization that matters. When we're really rigid and when we say we want this all the time and we do everything we can to make it available all the time, like we're good at that. That's the premise of modern industrial agriculture and fisheries, but that comes at an unseen ecological cost. Like it or not, change has to happen somewhere in an ecosystem. And if it's not happening in a way that we're a part of, it's going to happen in terms of environmental degradation that we're going to have to pay for. Well, I was going to say later, but now. So the cuisine level, right? Being more flexible consumers in the same way that indigenous peoples for millennia ate. They had seasonal rounds, calendars that were as much about what to eat and when to fish and hunt where as they were about what not to take when and where.
Interesting. Okay. Um, so that's at a consumer level. What can organizations and institutions do to help this happen?
That's a great question. And so much is made of the power of consumers in our food system and voting with our dollar. And in fact, so much power is in the hands of grocers and food businesses in determining what's marketed where, how, and when, and driving what's available. Everything from deciding to take a loss on certain products so that they sell more or to sell more to lower income segments. There's all these strategies that food companies do to promote what they want to sell, not necessarily what we're asking for. The growth of avocado in the North American diet, the growth of quinoa, these didn't happen because people were walking around grocery stores wondering where they were and calling agribusiness and saying produce more, right? These were marketing initiatives to make them more available. And they're healthy and it's a good thing. I'm not complaining. I like quinoa, I like avocados. But we have to acknowledge that there's a role for these grocers and these food retailers and other agribusinesses here in acknowledging that if they want to be good environmental stewards, they need to sort of resist the temptation to give people the easy, what they want right away, because that's what we've had. And trust us to be able to be flexible and willing to try new things and eat different things at different times of the year.
In your experience, do you think they want to be good stewards?
I think it's a real mix. I think that there are a handful and growing number of really earnest food businesses that are operating under this new class of business called a B corporation or a benefit corporation. And what that does is it sort of frees them from this sort of old school responsibility to shareholders to always grow. It allows them to make costly decisions that have social benefit, whereas traditional corporations are actually restricted in many ways from doing that. And so those corporations, I think, are trying everything they can, right? And the most famous, I think, B corporation that people might know is Patagonia, but there's tons of them and it's growing. And then the people operating in the more traditional business segment, I think the people in those organizations are trying to do really interesting things.
So, what I wanted to ask you after, talking about consumers and industry, what about governing bodies? Do governing bodies have a role to play in regenerating fisheries?
I think they really do. And we've seen, I think, a lot of earnest contributions of many state, federal, national level governments trying to put more effort into keeping fisheries sustainable because they are such, for many, an economic powerhouse, either in terms of formal economies like in the United States or the informal trade economies and important to people around the world. If fisheries go away, conflict, food insecurity, and so I have a sense that many nations really understand the stakes with fisheries That being said, the approaches that sort of they learned from academics, working in a very specific framing that actually was developed from the forestry industry. Um, Again, it's had some wins in terms of biological sustainability. But I think over the years we've learned it's a starting point, not a destination, and there's a lot of improvement to be had in terms of how we mandate management.
Okay, that's interesting that they're taking their cues from the forestry industry.
Yeah, the original concepts like maximum sustainable yield for fisheries really were adaptations of concepts from forestry.
Interesting. Okay. You've mentioned a couple of times, you've made reference a couple of times to indigenous cultures, and indigenous cultures play a lot in your book, which is called Finding Our Niche, and is a wonderful book. If anyone wants to purchase it, it's a really great read. So I'm wondering if you can talk about how it is or why it is that you turn so much to indigenous culture for clues and for solutions and ideas about how to regenerate.
Sure. And first, thanks for the kind words about the book. It's been out a couple of years now. It's something that I'm still always delighted to hear that somebody new has found it and read it. Thanks. So, when I went, the book really tells a number of stories. It's part environmental nonfiction, it's part autobiographical, and the parts where it starts relate to some very early and very formative mentor-mentee relationships I developed with a very specific indigenous person from Alaska, where I was in graduate school, Patrick Smith, who at the time I met him was chief of his community. And when I went to graduate school, I knew there was a bit of disillusionment myself, having come from a private sector job, going back into research and a university setting and thinking about the environment. And sort of the personal sort of story I went through of sort of reevaluating sort of the myths about our culture and our lives in the world that I had learned as a boy, to see fully formed and hear entirely different ways of seeing the world, seeing our relationship to it, and then coming to understand, all the science behind it, was really eye-opening for me. And so it became really important to me as a person who really believes in the power of story, to find a way to respectfully tell and share those stories, which are often not mine to tell, or I've been gifted with them to tell, or try to frame them in the book as I do as my own learnings from these experiences. There is, the environmental challenges, and sort of at the core of this is coming to understand that the environmental challenges we face are not just matters of technology failure. There's deeper cultural understandings of who we are and the way the world works. And if we don't get to those, we're kicking the can down the road.
Right. One of the things I love, and you talk about this toward the beginning of the book, is this idea that that there's land or areas that are pristine and wild, and then there's civilization, and that they're completely separate from each other, that humans haven't touched pristine land, and then there's what we did with civilization, and that we're corruptors and that we make everything bad. And the human touch is something you talk about. Can you talk about human touch and how you address it in that book?
Sure. Well, this is really a great example of one of those myths, the myths we tell ourselves about our basic human nature. These ideas, that humans are inherently self-interested beings and that we are inherently bad for the rest of the world around us are very modern. And our understandings that we've pinned our governance, our politics on, the way we work with environments, our modern conservation on, were all developed by people who had no knowledge of what would become the theories of evolution, by people who had no knowledge of the archaeological remains we would then find that would push the story of human history back millions of years. Right? So they were speculation. And we know that now, but we've never revisited them, really, at least not en masse, in light of everything we now know. And so this idea of the human touch, right, we see in our history all of the harms we've done. And it's wonderful that we see it now and that we are coming to regret it and trying to understand it and do something about it. But the mistake has been to assume that's all we can do. And when in fact, when you look at the diverse history and prehistory, if you, to call it that, of humanity, we've also been capable of remarkable things that are great for biodiversity. Um, no different than the way the beaver is great for biodiversity and great as an ecosystem engineer. And and when I was learning about as a student in ecology classes all of these amazing ways that species interact in nature, except for us, I kept thinking, wait, why are we the only ones? Right? We're also an animal. We're also a creature. Why are we the only ones excluded from having those sorts of relationships? And when you look for the stories, you find out that we're not.
Right. And you tell some great stories about very specific forests and swidens and things that humans have done to actually make a place better, to make the ecosystem
Mhm.
stronger, more abundant. Can you maybe share an example of one of those?
Absolutely. They're all around us in the places we think of as wild or pristine, really, or the places that settlers hundreds of years ago thought as untouched or unpeopled, really only look the way that they did or do because, in part, at least, people were a part of that land or seascape. The prairie grasslands, the high plains and prairies are a long peopled part of the world where indigenous use of fire, indigenous practices around hunting and sort of soft control of or soft influence over bison populations, all and agriculture, um, all really sort of coalesced in what we see as these grasslands. And then speaking about marine resources and fisheries on the west coast of North America, beach gardens and clam gardens, which I talk about at length in the book. These are ways that indigenous communities enhanced beaches and not just for food production, but by creating rock walls that served as reefs that really elevated all the biodiversity of the intertidal zone. Uh, and and these are just examples, and they're not rare. When I first set out to learn some about them, I thought they were unicorns. Everybody told me they were unicorns, and it turns out they're everywhere.
Amazing. And I think you mentioned Robin Wall Kimmerer.
Hmm.
Robin Wall Braiding Sweetgrass was the book, and I think
Yeah.
she mentions examples of that too, of the ways that humans go in and make a place. I don't want to say better, but they make a place, um, you know, better habitat for everything. All the creatures, including humans.
Yeah.
But that there's an intention to that. Um, and so you also talk about almost as a crazy idea, this idea that humans are going to come in and save nature.
Mm.
What is wrong with that kind of language?
Well, it assumes a lot, or presumes a lot, maybe is a better word. Um, Speaking of myths, right, one of the most ubiquitous myths in Western culture is that of the hero. And the hero really is a statement about what we believe to be true about civilization, is that there's a special kind of power and knowledge and expertise that we need to save things, to make them right when they otherwise would be wrong. And that's sort of the theory of change that's whispered to all of us living in modern society now about having to save the problem from itself. Um, but these issues we face, we don't need to, again, wait for a special technology or a special kind of knowledge that we don't have. There's no secrets we need to uncover to solve the problems we face. And so the hero idea, the saving idea, really is a bit of a savior complex, in the idea that there's some people who are especially endowed to solve it while everybody else isn't. And it contrasts so starkly from an indigenous approach, which is more aligned with the concepts of stewardship or guardianship or sentinel, where you serve as a person who is in relation with the rest of the world. You serve um, as a representative of a commitment to a relationship, to be in good relations with the rest of the world. You pay attention, you learn, you listen, you share that with other people, but you're not there trying to control things. You're not assuming that you need power to do it. What you actually need to be doing is acknowledging you're just one piece in the broader system.
Right. And again, it goes back to this idea of, are we outside of nature and manipulating it, and controlling it and saving it, or are we actually part of nature? And this brings me to the idea of sacrifice, that I think so much of what you hear, what I hear in the environmental movement, is about the sacrifices we have to make to save nature. And I suspect there's another way to frame this, another way to think about sacrifice. Maybe you can talk about that a bit.
Yeah, that it does. It comes from a very similar place, right? Where if we see the world as a needing to be fixed and developed by us, if there are parts of it that we have to leave alone, we're sacrificing, we're giving up. If we see our own well-being and health and affluence as being inherently at odds with that of other living things, we assume economically that there's going to be a trade-off, right? But I think we all intuit, we all know what it's like to have a really good friendship. And we know that a really good friendship is a really good one when you just give, right? And you get, but you're not in it for getting, right? You just give. And the whole of the friendship is way greater than the sum of its parts, right? And like a friendship, the being in good relationships, being friends with, having strong relationships with non-human living things in the world is a very similar premise. It just requires a bit of a shift in thinking from the more trade-off oriented economic thinking we all learn.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, I think, to reorient and think, well, I'm not trying to destroy or control or manipulate so much as I am stewarding. It's a really different kind of mindset. Um, and like you were saying earlier, we've been indoctrinated into believing that we're greedy and violent. And you have a different theory on this, and indigenous cultures have a different theory on this. What is our human nature if we're not inherently greedy and violent?
Well, we're clearly capable of a wide range of things, both positive and negative, right? And an author I really respect whose writing sort of kicked me on the trajectory that I'm on now, Daniel Quinn, in one of his books when he taught one of his characters uses the phrase, "We are not humanity." Not that we're not humans, but that what we're doing is not indicative of the basic nature of humanity. And I think what I take from that is that like any like any other creature in the world, we have come to live and cooperate and be in certain ways. And we are a very social species, and all the evidence is that we're a very cooperative species. Uh, and at the same time, under circumstances, under certain circumstances, we're capable of extremely self-interested behavior, and in a way that is self-interest in a way that is detrimental to the interests of others, which is almost sort of a contradiction. And so we need to look at the aspects of our society, the rules of the game that are pitting us against one another, and see that it's not necessarily the nature, but it's the structure and the rules by which we're being asked to play. And a lot of that has to do with how we produce our food in a very controlled and way where a lot of people have a lot more power than we do, where a lot of people own, control land and control the wealth and the resources. Um, but we have the potential to be very different, and a much longer track record of living differently than we do of living the way we do now.
Right. Um, yeah, and most of our recorded history is very recent when you look at the span of humanity. Um, well, let me bring this back to the idea of fisheries and this idea of bounty and abundance. And um, in the book, you talk about this idea that humans can find their niche. Niche is one of the key concepts, and that we can find our niche a way to, well, maybe you can explain. What does it mean to find our niche, and what would that mean in terms of fisheries in particular?
Sure. Yeah, the niche metaphor is central to the book, and really just about figuring out how we can go about living in a way that is in which we're acting like a good friend or being in good relations, acknowledging that we're capable of creating, and we do create very much impact, but we're also capable of trying to make that impact positive. And so the niche in ecology is it's sort of the both the various environmental circumstances that an organism can live in and the ones that they do right now. But again, like beavers and other species, lots of species sort of also alter their niche and grow it in a way that works for other species as well. So for us, finding the niche is almost a little bit more like rediscovering the niche in one way because we lived in niches that were more generative in the past. But there's also a lot more of us on the planet. We have different kinds of knowledge and technology, and so the future is going to be very different. So finding our niche in something like fisheries is about getting creative, not thinking about going back to something old, but looking at what we were capable of and what did work in the past and asking, why did that work? And how can we apply that wisdom of why it worked to what we're trying to do now? And so for fisheries, for modern fisheries, that goes back to the principles we talked about earlier about flexibility and diversity, and also generativity. Again, giving the counterintuitive premise that giving more than you take ends up in more being available for everything in living systems. And there's really cool work in physics that's suggesting that that's actually driven by basic laws of physics. That and so that's finding our niche. It's really about acknowledging and sort of also breaking free of a bit of an alienation that we currently have because we feel like we don't belong. We're not supposed to be there. We have to put a fence between us and the rest of the natural world. But finding that niche also is kind of like a coming home in a sense.
And this almost ends up sounding like an exercise in having self-compassion for our species. I think a lot of times we talk about how we're so invasive and destructive, and actually maybe there is a way for us to find a way to, as you said, benefit not just our species but lots of other species, so that we're all kind of helping each other. But it does sound like it takes trial and error.
Yes, there's no final outcome where then everything stops changing, right? It's a process. It's more about the ethical space in which we're trying to live, as opposed to the specific details of how we live in any point in time.
And that's a really interesting concept too, I think, is that it's not like you finish the work. If anything, you change your mindset, you change your approach, and keep doing that forever.
Yeah. Yeah. And the funny thing about change that seems small or slow or incremental is that it is until it's not. All of a sudden, you look around, and so much has changed, right? That's the beauty of tipping points.
Yeah, I would say I've seen a couple of major tipping points in my lifetime, and it's amazing to think about. I mean, just Snoop Dogg at the Olympics is amazing to me.
Isn't it lovely?
Never would have imagined in a million years. So, any other thoughts about fisheries or regeneration or mindset before we say goodbye?
I think that I would maybe end on just a note of optimism about things, because fisheries are a really great example of this global juggernaut that seems almost too big to constrain and control. And at the same time, I've witnessed, and have many colleagues and friends who have witnessed people doing things differently. And again, small change is often invisible until it's not. And the tensions I see in the world of fisheries and in the world of food in general and in politics in general really make me believe that we are closer to a tipping point than we think. We're not at the beginning of solving these problems anymore, and we haven't been for a long time. It just can sometimes be hard to see the progress. So the optimistic note perhaps is that we're closer than we think. And then what does that mean for what we do? I think that means we push like it's the last push to get over instead of the first to get up the hill.
That's great. I love that. That's a really nice note to end on. Thank you so much. Again, this is Philip Loring, and you're listening to Unconfined Podcast. We're talking about aquatic foods in this series, and Philip has some great things to say about regeneration. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Okay, yeah, it was a pleasure.
This is an episode of Unconfined, a podcast of the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future in Baltimore, Maryland. You can find us online at clf.jhsph.edu.